Sometimes the greatest miracle does not begin with applause. Sometimes it begins when one ordinary man decides that another human life is worth more than his own comfort. Three black Cadillacs rolled slowly into the parking lot of Walker Auto Repair just after 8 o'clock on a crisp Nebraska morning, their polished paint reflecting the golden sunlight as every conversation in the small town seemed to stop at once. Customers waiting beside aging pickup trucks lowered their coffee cups. Mechanics paused with wrenches still in their hands. A mail carrier standing across the street forgot to finish placing letters into a mailbox. No one in Maple Ridge had ever seen three luxury cars arrive together at Ethan Walker's modest garage. Ethan himself looked up from beneath the hood of a 10-year-old Ford pickup, wiping grease from his hands with a faded shop towel before quietly stepping forward. At 41 years old, the widowed single father had spent nearly 2 decades fixing engines instead of chasing recognition. His blue work shirt carried the marks of honest labor. His work boots had seen countless early mornings, and the calm expression on his weathered face revealed a man who expected nothing extraordinary from life except another chance to provide for his young daughter. The rear door of the first Cadillac opened. A woman dressed in an elegant cream-colored business suit stepped onto the pavement, followed respectfully by 2 assistants and several security professionals who remained several steps behind. Her blonde hair moved gently in the autumn breeze as she looked directly toward Ethan with eyes filled not with authority but with gratitude. The crowd exchanged puzzled whispers as she walked across the parking lot without hesitation. Ethan studied her face, sensing that he had seen her somewhere before, yet the memory refused to surface. Before anyone could speak, the woman closed the remaining distance between them and wrapped her arms around him. The entire parking lot fell silent. Even the distant sounds of passing traffic seemed to disappear. Ethan stood motionless, surprised by the unexpected embrace from a complete stranger whose presence suggested extraordinary influence and success. When she finally stepped back, tears shimmered softly in her eyes, and her voice trembled with emotion as she spoke words that no one present would ever forget. "Because of you," she whispered, "my son is alive today." A wave of confusion spread through the gathered neighbors. Ethan blinked in disbelief, searching her face for an explanation he could not yet understand. He had never met her child. In fact, he did not even know she had one. The woman smiled through grateful tears before gently placing one hand over her heart. "You saved 2 lives that day," she continued. "You simply did not know it." Ethan remained silent, his humble nature refusing to interrupt, while everyone around them waited for the mystery to unfold. The autumn wind stirred the leaves across the parking lot, carrying with it the feeling that an ordinary morning had quietly transformed into something unforgettable. And as Ethan looked into the face of the woman standing before him, the memory finally returned, carrying him back to the violent storm over Silver Lake that had changed both of their lives forever. The memory carried Ethan Walker back to the previous morning, long before anyone in Maple Ridge had heard the sound of 3 luxury cars arriving at his garage. Like every weekday, his alarm rang at 5:30, and within minutes the small house was filled with the comforting aroma of fresh coffee and pancakes. His 9-year-old daughter, Lily, shuffled into the kitchen, wearing oversized socks and a sleepy smile that never failed to brighten his day. "Did you remember my science project?" she asked while climbing onto her chair. Ethan smiled and lifted a carefully packed model from the countertop. "I finished reinforcing it after you went to bed. I did not want the wind to damage it on the way to school." Lily hugged him without saying another word. Those quiet moments matter more to Ethan than anything money could buy. After walking Lily to the school bus stop, he drove his aging pickup truck to Walker Auto Repair, unlocking the weathered garage doors just as the first rays of sunlight spread across the Nebraska sky. His first customer of the morning was an elderly rancher worried about a strange noise coming from his truck. After a careful inspection, Ethan discovered that only a worn belt needed replacing instead of the expensive repair another shop had recommended. The old man reached for his wallet with visible relief. "You could have charged me for a whole new system," he admitted. Ethan simply shrugged with an easy smile. "You only needed a belt. I fix what is broken, not what is working." The rancher nodded slowly before replying. That is why this town trusts you. By late morning, several customers filled the waiting area while engines hummed inside the garage. Ethan moved from one repair to another with steady confidence, never rushing, never cutting corners, treating every vehicle as though his own family would be riding inside. Hanging neatly along one wall were bright orange life jackets, rescue ropes, waterproof flashlights, and emergency medical kits. Visitors often asked why a mechanic kept so much rescue equipment inside an auto shop. The answer was simple. Ethan had volunteered with the county water rescue team for years because Silver Lake, beautiful as it appeared on calm days, could become dangerously unpredictable whenever storms rolled across the plains. Shortly after noon, the weather radio resting near his toolbox crackled to life with a severe thunderstorm warning covering much of the county. Dark clouds slowly gathered beyond the open garage doors, replacing the bright blue sky with heavy shades of gray. A cool wind swept across the parking lot, carrying the unmistakable scent of approaching rain. Ethan quietly stepped outside and studied the horizon for a long moment before returning inside. Without saying much, he checked every battery inside his rescue flashlight, inspected the ropes, and made certain the emergency equipment remained ready. His co-workers noticed the routine and exchanged knowing glances. They had seen him prepare this way before. Ethan never hoped for an emergency, but he believed preparation was one of the purest forms of caring for complete strangers. As thunder rolled faintly across the distant hills and the first drops of rain tapped gently against the garage windows, none of the people inside realized that somewhere above the gathering storm, a private jet carrying a woman they had never met was already flying toward the moment that would forever connect two completely different worlds. Rain arrived faster than anyone expected. Within minutes, the quiet streets of Maple Ridge disappeared beneath sheets of water as powerful winds bent the trees surrounding Silver Lake. Ethan Walker had just finished securing the last toolbox when the emergency radio clipped to his belt burst to life with urgent voices. Possible aircraft emergency over Silver Lake. Volunteer responders stand by. Every movement inside the garage stopped. Ethan did not hesitate. He calmly removed his mechanic gloves, reached for the bright orange rescue jacket hanging on the wall, and loaded rescue ropes, waterproof flashlights, and a medical kit into his aging pickup truck. One of his coworkers looked toward the dark sky with concern. "Be careful out there." Ethan nodded once. "I always am." The drive to the lake normally took 12 minutes, but the heavy rain slowed every vehicle on the road. As he approached the shoreline, flashing lights from sheriff deputies, firefighters, and emergency medical crews reflected across the rough water. High above the lake, a private business jet fought through the violent storm, its navigation lights barely visible between rolling clouds. Inside the aircraft, Victoria Sterling remained calm despite the growing tension around her. The pilot spoke steadily with air traffic control while warning lights illuminated the cockpit. Flight attendants reassured the passengers as the aircraft encountered powerful turbulence. Victoria quietly held a waterproof leather case against her chest. To anyone else, it looked like an ordinary business portfolio, but to her it contained something far more valuable than contracts or financial records. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, placed one hand gently over the case, and silently prayed that everyone aboard would reach home safely. Outside, another burst of wind pushed the aircraft lower. The pilot announced that he would attempt an emergency landing on the calmest section of Silver Lake rather than risk nearby neighborhoods. Through the rain-covered windshield, the water appeared only as a dark mirror stretching beneath the storm. Along the shoreline, Ethan watched the descending aircraft with focused eyes. Every instinct told him that the pilot was doing everything possible to protect the people below. For one hopeful second, it appeared the landing might succeed. Then a sudden crosswind forced the aircraft sideways just before it reached the surface. The jet struck the lake with tremendous force, sending towering waves across the shoreline before sliding through the water and gradually coming to rest partially submerged several hundred feet from land. Emergency crews immediately launched rescue boats, while firefighters prepared flotation equipment. Without waiting for instructions, Ethan secured a rescue rope around his waist, entered the cold water, and swam toward the aircraft beside other trained volunteers. Working together, they helped frightened passengers safely onto rescue boats one by one. The pilot emerged. The flight attendant emerged. Every visible passenger reached safety. As the final rescue boat prepared to pull away, one exhausted passenger looked back toward the aircraft with panic in her voice. "Wait," she cried. The woman in the front cabin never came out. Ethan immediately turned toward the slowly sinking jet. Rain continued pounding the lake as dark water crept higher along the windows. Around him, experienced rescuers exchanged worried glances, knowing every passing second mattered. Ethan looked once toward the rescue boat carrying the survivors, then back toward the silent aircraft. Without saying a single word, he filled his lungs with one deep breath and disappeared beneath the storm once more. The icy water closed above Ethan Walker as the roar of the storm faded into an eerie silence. Guided only by the beam of his waterproof flashlight, he swam toward the front section of the aircraft where the remaining passenger had last been seen. The cabin was tilted sharply now, with loose papers drifting through the water like pale leaves. Ethan pushed through the narrow aisle, carefully checking every seat until he spotted a woman struggling near the front compartment. Victoria Sterling was conscious, but her foot had become caught beneath a twisted piece of luggage that had shifted during the emergency landing. She held a small waterproof leather case tightly against her chest with one arm, while using the other to free herself. Ethan reached her and immediately signaled for her to stay calm. She looked into his eyes for only a moment before silently trusting the stranger who had appeared through the darkness. Working carefully, Ethan lifted the heavy luggage just enough for her to slide her foot free. He pointed toward the nearest exit, but Victoria quickly shook her head and looked toward the leather case that had slipped from her grasp and floated several feet away. Ethan followed her gaze without understanding why such an ordinary object mattered during an emergency. To him, it seemed like a simple business case that could easily be replaced. Still, he recognized the desperation in her expression. Without hesitation, he pushed through the water, retrieved the case, and placed it firmly back into her hands. Relief instantly softened her frightened face. She held the case close, nodded gratefully, and followed Ethan toward the emergency exit. Together, they emerged into the pounding rain, where rescue crews immediately pulled them aboard a waiting boat. Victoria coughed lightly as emergency medical personnel wrapped warm blankets around her shoulders and checked her condition. Ethan remained nearby only long enough to confirm that she was breathing comfortably before stepping aside, so the paramedics could continue their work. No introductions were exchanged. No names were shared. To Ethan, she was simply another person who had needed help. As the rescue boats returned to shore, the storm slowly began losing its strength. Dark clouds drifted eastward, allowing faint afternoon sunlight to break through for the first time in hours. At Maple Ridge Regional Medical Center, physicians completed thorough examinations for every passenger. After several anxious minutes, a smiling obstetrician entered Victoria's room with reassuring news. "Your baby is doing well," the doctor said gently. "Everything looks stable." Victoria closed her eyes as tears quietly rolled down her cheeks, this time not from fear, but from overwhelming gratitude. She placed one hand over her unborn child and the other on the waterproof case resting beside her hospital bed. Inside were ultrasound photographs, medical records, handwritten letters to her future son, and a tiny pair of baby socks she had purchased only days before. None of it could ever be replaced. She whispered a quiet prayer of thanks before asking the one question that mattered most. "Who saved me?" A nurse glanced through the rescue report and answered softly. "A volunteer from Maple Ridge. His name is Ethan Walker." Victoria repeated the name slowly, committing every syllable to memory. Across town, completely unaware that one of the wealthiest women in America had just spoken his name with profound gratitude, Ethan returned to his modest garage, changed back into his grease-stained work shirt, and quietly finished repairing the old pickup truck he had promised to have ready before sunset. By sunrise the following morning, life had already settled back into its familiar rhythm for Ethan Walker. He unlocked the garage before most of Maple Ridge had finished breakfast, switched on the old fluorescent lights, and quietly organized his tools as if the extraordinary events at Silver Lake had been nothing more than another responsibility fulfilled. His co-workers tried to congratulate him after hearing reports from the rescue teams, but Ethan simply smiled and reminded them that everyone had worked together. "No one saves lives alone," he said before returning to the engine, waiting on his lift. Across the state, however, the rescue had become the only subject inside the executive offices of Sterling Aerospace. Victoria Sterling sat near the large windows of her private hospital suite, watching soft morning light spread across the city skyline, while physicians confirmed once again that both she and her unborn son were healthy. The relief she felt was impossible to measure. Her chief of staff entered carrying a tablet filled with reports from emergency responders, insurance, investigators, and company executives, but Victoria ignored every document except one page containing the name Ethan Walker. "Tell me everything about him," she said quietly. Within an hour, her team learned that Ethan was a widowed father raising his 9-year-old daughter Lily, that he owned a small repair shop in Maple Ridge, and that he had volunteered for county water rescues for years without seeking recognition. They also discovered that he had refused several public interviews that morning, telling local reporters there were people far more deserving of attention than himself. Victoria looked at the photograph of Ethan standing beside his weathered garage with grease on his hands and kindness in his eyes. She smiled gently before closing the file. "He did not even ask my name," she whispered. One executive suggested transferring a substantial financial reward directly into Ethan's bank account. Another proposed purchasing his business and expanding it into a statewide automotive chain. Victoria slowly shook her head. "If he could not be tempted to leave another person behind during the worst moment of my life, money will never be the language that reaches his heart." She remained silent for several seconds before making a different decision. "Prepare 3 vehicles. We're going to thank him face to face." Meanwhile, Ethan spent the morning replacing brake pads, rotating tires, and answering questions from loyal customers who had heard rumors about the rescue. Every compliment made him slightly uncomfortable. He insisted that trained volunteers had simply done what they were prepared to do. Shortly before 8 o'clock, the low rumble of powerful engines echoed down the quiet street. Neighbors looked outside their homes. Store owners stepped on the sidewalks. Children riding bicycles slowed to a stop. 3 polished black Cadillacs entered the parking lot one after another with quiet precision, their glossy finish reflecting the bright Nebraska sun. The doors opened almost simultaneously as professionally dressed assistants stepped aside. Then Victoria Sterling emerged with calm confidence, carrying the waterproof leather case in one hand and gratitude in her heart. Ethan looked up from the open hood of an old pickup truck, wiped his hands with a faded shop towel, and walked forward politely, still having no idea why one of the most influential women in America had traveled hundreds of miles simply to stand before the ordinary mechanic who had believed saving a stranger was never something worthy of recognition. Victoria Sterling stopped only a few feet from Ethan Walker before setting the waterproof leather case gently on the hood of the pickup truck he had been repairing. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet morning seemed to hold its breath as curious neighbors watched from every corner of the parking lot. Then Victoria smiled with genuine warmth, the kind that came not from business success, but from a heart that had been given another chance. "I finally found you," she said softly. Ethan nodded politely, still uncertain why she had traveled so far. "I'm glad you're doing well," he replied. "That is all that matters." Victoria looked at him with surprise. "You remember me?" Ethan smiled modestly. "I remember everyone I help. I just never expect to see them again." Those simple words carried more sincerity than the polished speeches she had heard in countless boardrooms. She slowly opened the leather case and removed several ultrasound photographs along with a tiny pair of baby socks folded neatly beside them. The crowd remained silent as she carefully held them in her hands. When you came back into that aircraft, you probably thought you were saving a business case. Ethan nodded honestly. I assumed it was important to you. Victoria looked down at the photographs before raising her eyes once more. It contained the first pictures of my son, every medical record from my pregnancy, letters I've been writing to him since I learned he existed, and the first gift I ever bought for him. Her voice grew quieter as emotion filled every word. If you had decided that case was not worth retrieving, I would have understood. Instead, you chose kindness before knowing its value. Ethan listened without interrupting. He glanced briefly at the tiny socks before returning his attention to Victoria. Any parent would have done the same, he answered. Victoria gently shook her head. Not everyone goes back when everyone else is already safe. She reached into a folder one of her assistants handed to her and removed a certified cashier's check made payable to Ethan Walker. The amount printed across the paper represented more money than many people would earn in a lifetime. Gasps spread through the small crowd as several neighbors caught sight of the number. Victoria extended the check toward him with both hands. Please accept this, she said. It will never equal what you gave me, but I hope it can express my gratitude. Ethan looked at the check for only a second before carefully folding Victoria's fingers back around it. His expression remained calm, respectful, and unwavering. I cannot accept payment for helping someone come home to their family, he said. If I ever expected money before doing the right thing, then it would no longer be the right thing. A deep silence settled across the parking lot. Even Victoria's executives lowered their eyes, humbled by the simplicity of his conviction. For the first time in many years, Victoria realized she had encountered something no fortune could purchase and no corporation could manufacture. She slowly returned the check to its envelope, smiled through grateful tears, and said, "Then I will find another way to honor what you have done, because people like you should never stand alone." Ethan simply nodded, believing the conversation had ended, never imagining that her next decision would transform not only his own life, but the future of an entire community beside Silver Lake. Victoria Sterling left Maple Ridge that afternoon, but her promise remained in Ethan Walker's thoughts only for a few minutes before another customer arrived needing a transmission repair. Life quickly returned to its familiar pace. Ethan picked Lily up from school, listened patiently as she excitedly described her science presentation, and spent the evening helping her with homework before they shared homemade soup at the small kitchen table. Lily noticed that her father seemed unusually quiet. "Is everything all right?" she asked. Ethan smiled reassuringly. "Everything is fine. Sometimes people are simply grateful, and that is enough." He never mentioned the cashier's check or the luxury cars because he believed those moments belonged to the people whose lives had been changed, not to him. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Victoria sat inside the conference room at Sterling Aerospace, surrounded by architects, engineers, emergency management consultants, and members of her executive team. Detailed blueprints covered the long table, yet none of them reflected the idea growing in her heart. She looked around the room before speaking with calm certainty. "I do not want to build another building with my family name engraved above the entrance. I want to build something that gives ordinary people the chance to save extraordinary lives." The room fell silent as she continued. "Silver Lake nearly became the place where my son and I disappeared forever. Instead, it became the place where a stranger reminded me what quiet courage looks like. One consultant suggested donating money to existing rescue organizations. Another recommended establishing a scholarship. Victoria listened respectfully before gently shaking her head. Those ideas are generous, but they do not solve the problem that nearly cost us everything. Small communities deserve the same rescue training and equipment as large cities." She pointed toward a map of Maple Ridge displayed on the screen. "That is where we begin." Over the following weeks, surveyors visited land near Silver Lake while construction crews prepared the site for a modern community rescue and emergency response center. The project included rescue boats, advanced training classrooms, weather monitoring equipment, medical supplies, and educational programs for local families. Victoria insisted that every service remain free to the public. She also made one unusual request that surprised everyone involved. No statue would be placed at the entrance. No portrait of her would hang inside the building. Instead, the central wall would carry a simple inscription that read, "Quiet dignity saves lives." When reporters asked why she had invested millions of dollars in a small Nebraska town, she answered with the same sentence every time. "One good man reminded me that compassion is strongest when no reward is expected." Ethan learned about the project only after a county official visited his garage with architectural drawings requesting his opinion as an experienced volunteer rescuer. He studied the plans with genuine interest before asking a simple question. "Will local children be allowed to learn water safety here?" The official smiled. "That is one of the first programs being planned." Ethan nodded with quiet satisfaction. "Then it will help families long after we are gone." As the first steel beams rose beside Silver Lake beneath the bright autumn sky, neither Ethan nor Victoria fully understood that the greatest gift created by one selfless decision would never be measured in dollars, but in the countless strangers who would one day return safely home, because one ordinary act of kindness had inspired an entire community to prepare before the next storm arrived. Winter gradually surrendered to spring, and with each passing week the rescue center beside Silver Lake grew closer to completion. Steel beams gave way to bright classrooms, rescue docks stretched confidently into the calm water, and rows of orange life jackets hung neatly beside modern emergency equipment waiting for the day they might protect another family. Ethan Walker visited the construction site only when county officials invited him to review training areas from the perspective of a volunteer rescuer. He never offered grand speeches or demanded recognition. Instead, he quietly suggested practical details that only years of real experience could teach. Place the first aid supplies closer to the docks, he recommended one afternoon. During an emergency, every second feels shorter than it really is. Engineers made the adjustment without hesitation. Victoria Sterling noticed that Ethan never tried to impress anyone. He simply wanted strangers to have a better chance of returning home. The rescue center officially opened beneath a bright blue Nebraska sky as hundreds of residents gathered along the lakeshore. Families explored classrooms where children learned water safety. Volunteers practiced rescue techniques, and experienced instructors demonstrated how ordinary people could remain calm during unexpected emergencies. There were local officials, firefighters, teachers, and neighbors from surrounding counties. Yet when the ribbon was finally cut, Victoria quietly stepped aside and invited Ethan to stand near the entrance instead. He looked uncomfortable with the attention and gently declined the spotlight, encouraging the volunteer rescue team to stand together instead. Victoria smiled because that response was exactly what she had expected. During the afternoon, Lily eagerly joined a youth water safety program, carefully learning how to throw rescue ropes, wear flotation equipment correctly, and recognize dangerous weather conditions before stepping near the water. Ethan watched proudly from a distance while instructors praised her patience and confidence. "Your father must have taught you well," one instructor said. Lily smiled brightly. "He always says helping people begins long before an emergency starts." Victoria happened to overhear those words as she walked through the training area, and they stayed with her for the rest of the day. Over the following months, she returned to Maple Ridge whenever her schedule allowed, never arriving with unnecessary ceremony. Sometimes she shared lunch with volunteers after training exercises. Sometimes she visited the local elementary school to support safety education programs. Sometimes she simply stood beside Silver Lake in quiet reflection, grateful that the place she once associated with fear had become a symbol of hope. Ethan continued repairing trucks each morning exactly as he always had. Customers still found him underneath old engines with grease on his hands and a calm smile on his face. Success had not changed him because his values had never depended upon circumstances. Slowly, a sincere friendship formed between Ethan and Victoria, built not upon wealth or influence, but upon mutual respect. They rarely spoke about the rescue itself. Instead, they discussed the future of the community, the importance of second chances, and the responsibility every generation carries to prepare the next one. As children laughed along the shoreline during their final safety lesson of the season and rescue volunteers completed another successful training exercise, Victoria quietly realized that the greatest investment she had ever made was not measured by the building she had funded, but by the confidence growing inside ordinary people who now believed they could one day become the calm stranger someone else desperately needed. 1 year later, the first light of a warm summer morning shimmered across the peaceful surface of Silver Lake, where laughter had replaced fear and preparation had replaced uncertainty. The rescue center had become the heart of the community, welcoming families, volunteers, students, and visitors from neighboring counties who wanted to learn the simple skills that could one day save a life. Rescue boats rested neatly along the docks. Classrooms echoed with encouragement instead of anxiety, and the words "quiet dignity saves lives" greeted every person who walked through the front entrance. Ethan Walker arrived before sunrise, just as he always did before volunteer training sessions. He inspected rescue equipment, checked weather reports, and greeted every new volunteer with the same quiet respect regardless of age or experience. Nothing about his routine suggested that newspapers across the country had once called him a hero. To Ethan, he was still a mechanic, still a father, and still someone responsible for helping where he could. Lily, now more confident than ever, assisted younger children during their water safety class, patiently showing them how to wear life jackets correctly and how to remain calm during emergencies. Watching her from across the training dock, Ethan realized that the greatest lesson she had learned was never about rescue techniques. It was about compassion becoming a habit instead of single action. Shortly before the afternoon ceremony began, 3 familiar black Cadillacs quietly entered the parking lot once again. This time, however, no one stared with curiosity. The people of Maple Ridge smiled warmly because Victoria Sterling had become more than a successful business leader. She had become a trusted friend. Victoria stepped from the vehicle carrying a smiling baby boy in her arms. Little James reached toward the bright sunlight with innocent wonder as she slowly walked toward Ethan. When she reached him, she gently placed the child into Ethan's waiting arms. Ethan looked down with a humble smile as the little boy wrapped tiny fingers around one of his weathered hands. Victoria's voice grew soft with emotion. "James will never remember the day you saved him," she said, "but I will spend the rest of my life making certain he knows the kind of man who gave him the chance to grow up." Ethan looked at the happy child before quietly answering, "Then teach him to help someone else one day. That will be more than enough." Victoria nodded, understanding that his greatest wish had never been recognition. It had always been that kindness would continue beyond him. As families gathered for a community photograph beside the lake, firefighters stood beside teachers, volunteers stood beside business leaders, children stood beside grandparents, and Ethan naturally moved toward the back of the group, hoping others would stand in front. Victoria noticed and gently guided him back to the center without a single word. The camera captured smiling faces, bright skies, calm water, and a community forever changed by one quiet decision made during a storm. Looking at that photograph years later, few people would remember the expensive cars, the successful corporation, or the remarkable wealth that had arrived in Maple Ridge. They would remember that an ordinary single father had chosen compassion without asking who deserved it. And because of that single choice, countless strangers found second chances, a little boy grew into a healthy future, and an entire town discovered that the most powerful legacy in life is never built by money alone, but by quiet dignity shared one selfless act at a time.